Okay. Thank you for sticking with us till the very end on a quite hot and busy day. I know you're very excited to hear about how fantastic Norwegian civil society is doing. I got the assignment from Vera to do a kind of 101 on the state of relations between the state and civil society in Norway. It's not actually the easiest assignment because at the same time I don't want to downplay what's good about Norway, but I don't want to idealize it either. You know, it's still a society and it's never perfect and there's always conflict, and we'll get into a bit of that. So to get started, right, so just a few words about myself. I'm Jean-Christophe Delmas. I'm from the Norwegian Helsinki committee. I have kind of several hats there, but one of them is as a kind of partner to the Reclaim Civil Society project. And I'm also working with civil society around Central and Eastern Europe, mostly on the Active Citizens Fund. And yeah, the Helsinki Committee, I guess most of you know, we have a sister here and sister organizations elsewhere in Poland as well, and the Netherlands, among others. And now to get into the presentation. So I'm going to go into a few key features of Norwegian civil society, and you know, we've been talking about the EU, what the EU does right, what the EU does wrong, and you know, throughout the day I've had kind of light bulbs going off in my head because so much of what we've been talking about the EU is moving towards this ideal that seems to be this kind of Nordic ideal of how civil society is supposed to work. And you know, if you have a model, you have an ideal, you want to do something that's replicable. And that's not always certain that's the case because the fundamentals might not be the same. So in the case of Norwegian civil society, just what's at top of your head, what defines Norwegian society? One or two words, if someone wants to throw out something.
Membership.
What's that?
Membership.
Membership, yeah, that's an excellent start. Also feel free to come out with stereotypes, cliches. Anything else? One word, two words?
Egalitarian.
Egalitarian, voluntary, good. That's the presentation, we're done. No, I found this earlier, it's nice. It's just outside the government building where the Prime Minister is. It's as you can see, it looks like it's huge, but actually the statue is about this big. And it's 50,000 tiny people supporting the pavement, right? It's this kind of self-perception that Norway has. And I guess that's kind of a summary of what you've been saying. And what underpins this perception is this kind of Nordic model of civil society, right? So 78% of Norwegians are a partner organization, and on average, the average Norwegian is a member of 4 organizations. So if you think of what that does, if you compare that with the EU trying to create a kind of civil society for itself, when it can't find a society, here you have a society that's basically creating its own reality in a sense. It's relatively large. There's about 2,000 NGOs. How you count that really depends. And 2/3 are established after 1960, or you could 1/3 were before 1960 because it's quite old. Altogether, quite small actually, 4% of GDP, but still, relatively speaking, fairly important. And now income. So what Norwegian is a member of 4 organizations, that means a lot of membership fees and means relatively little in the way of public funding, right? Compared to the EU average, 55%. It's 56% of income comes from membership fees for organizations. And this has an important structural meaning for how civil society works. There's less of a dependence on the state. And I guess from there on, it gets easier in a sense. Now, how organizations are funded, of course, there's different models. You have the kind of the mostly state-funded, the kind of gongo, right? But except that they're allowed to criticize the government. So that's, you have the, I'm going to focus on human rights organizations because I'm the Helsinki committee, but you have the Norwegian Center of Human Rights, the University of Oslo, and so on. And then you have the kind of total opposite, the amnesty model. They have 100,000 members and they don't take any money from government, which is a kind of principled stance for them. And then, of course, you have the kind of umbrella organizations, the hybrid models, like the Helsinki Committee. We kind of mostly government, also not institutional, a bit different. And I'm going to skip over this because it's quite late in the day, but to give you an idea of how civil society in Norway developed, it's kind of like the classical standard, you know, it's a history of interest groups developing over the 19th century, in conflict with government, but also being co-opted by government. And that's kind of where we are today. I'm going to skip over this block of text, but it's exemplifying what we've just been on. And now to today. So as I mentioned, there's several aspects. Consultation on one hand, confrontation on the other. They form a whole because the rules of the game are such that you can always criticize government. And the unspoken rule is that you'll never lose funding. And I think that might be one of the key elements, right? On the one hand, the one pillar, membership mostly, but also for the NGOs that do get money from government, you could criticize government, nothing would happen to you. And even if I were to take it further, perversely, if you criticize government, maybe you're preventing government from taking money away from you. Because, you know, it'd make a scandal. And Norwegian media, they're merciless on this kind of thing. And if anything were to come out on some kind of political interference and this kind of thing, it costs. So consultation, and you have several instances for how this works, right? In the Helsinki Committee's case, we're part of this NGO Forum for Human Rights. The way that works is whenever the government needs some kind of expertise on some kind of human rights question, or they want to avoid embarrassing themselves by saying something or doing something outlandish, they call in this NGO Forum that has about 50 organizations that work with human rights in Norway. And I mean, this is quite typical. If you think of the EU Commission, this is like the consultations that you have for everything, right? And kind of a case of parallel evolution, I guess. Then at the same time, you have this kind of process of confrontation. As I mentioned, you can criticize government, you can sue the government. This is becoming very popular. I'll get into that in a moment. And of course, another interaction with government is applying for money from government. And this happens also through a number of ways. It's not very well streamlined, to be honest. And then government, you have parliament on the other hand, but just to kind of summarize the point of parliament is that you have what happens is Oslo, but also you have this kind of hyper-local dimension, this kind of multi-level dimension, because as a parliamentary democracy, every MP has his case, has, you know, possible entry routes for lobbying, and there are endless possibilities for coalition forming. Yeah, and also obviously at the national level, the parliament is very strong in Norway, and you have all these different committees, and also possible entry routes for lobbying. So now to go through over the theoretical into how this works out in practice. Not always well, don't worry, I'll translate. In this case, we just had the announcement from government that they're going to cut 75 million euros from the budget for development. So that's 20% off the development budget, but it's the worst cut, you know, we've had in the Western countries since Donald Trump cut from UNESCO. And there wasn't really any kind of consultation, you know, beforehand. It was just kind of an announcement, and now we're kind of left trying to figure out what happened. So, you know, there are always avenues to bypass this kind of preemptive consultation and these kind of, you know, you can always end up with this kind of guillotine approach where political imperatives force government to kind of take these quite drastic decisions. That was criticized by Antonio Guterres just recently. But, you know, nothing is ever done until it's done, and the budget hasn't been ratified yet. Another case study. This is an interesting case that kind of that mixes it all. It's wind power in Norway is a very wind power, as in electric windmills and so on, right? It's a very inflammatory topic. Strangely enough, it causes a lot of very agitated political discourse, and they built a windmill park in a Sami reindeer migration area. And there was a case which was brought up by a coalition of NGOs, including Sami NGOs, an anti-wind power NGO, and a few environmental NGOs, which brought the case to the Supreme Court in Norway, which ruled that it was an infringement on the UN Human Rights Convention. So now, just recently, the government apologized for setting up the wind park, and they're having to take it all down. But yeah, wind power is a very difficult topic in Norway. Very brief conclusions. And I hope there's something here for us to take further. I understand that there's a little wrap up after this. Is Norway a model in the sense that it's something that you can replicate? Well, I don't think you can replicate anything insofar as the fundamentals are so different, right? You have this membership basis. The EU Commission exists in a kind of, to characterize, in a kind of bubble of its own creation, is trying to find civil society where it can, but at the same time without listening to civil society, right? This is what we've been discussing. And in Norway, it's very hard to say where civil society stops and where government starts. There's often this intermeshing. And rules of the game, as I mentioned, you can always criticize government. You shouldn't expect anything after that. And media are vicious when it comes to enforcing this. So I hope that's been informational. Feel free if you have any questions, maybe questions to Marta first. I know she needs to go if you have anything since last. Thank you.